All right, welcome to the Takedown, everybody. I know we've had some time where we haven't had an episode, so I want to make sure that I go ahead and meet with you guys today, so we can go ahead and get an episode in. I actually missed doing the show, but as usual, if for those of us that are still in college or still doing that, this time of the year is particularly busy. But I just got through with that, so now we should be right back on schedule as usual. So we'll be coming back again first Monday of the month as best we can. And if we can't get those episodes in, we'll be doing them either recording, and I'll have them up on both the Benjamin Dixon Show's channel, and I'll also have it up on my channel as well, so you can see that information. So I haven't been on since, about mid-November, but there's a lot that's happened. We've had a bunch of elections. We've had, just our typical, garbage in, garbage out of day-to-day political news. And seems like sexual harassment in the workplace is kind of coming to the forefront. And I think that that's definitely a conversation that should be had. And I have some thoughts on that. So we're going to start there. We're going to start basically with sexual harassment. And I'm also wanting to let everybody know I also have Richard here with me. And we'll be kind of talking it out. As usual, I'm going to be very inflammatory. So Richard's here to kind of curb that. So Richard, say hello to the people.
Hello. Hey, it's been a while since I've been on the camera. I've been with Brandon on the Discourse, and we've been doing some stuff over there. Brandon's been really busy. You can check it out on the SoundCloud / expanding the Discourse, and make sure to check those out. There's lots of episodes up there, so if you haven't caught us on the YouTube, since we haven't been there, you can see some new content over there. I just wanted to mention that, and I'm looking forward to the conversation, and thank you, Nick, for having me on.
All right. So I think, there's a lot of stuff that goes on when we start talking about, sexual harassment and violence. And I think the first thing I want to say is that, while I think it's good that there is a lot of outcry and like some people are like, some of the worst offenders are being punished. Like, I think at the same time, fundamental to why a lot of this goes on is because the job market and how it's organized, how opportunities are divvied out, there's a lot of discretion given to people with power to give favors based on whatever. And I think that's at the root of the problem. Like, if they weren't able to, arbitrarily decide to give you a raise or arbitrarily decide to promote you to whatever position and pay you whatever in comparison to your peers, arbitrarily, right? Based on anything, whether you rub their back, whether you do something strange for them, whatever you do for them, if they weren't able to do that, you would have a lot less problems there. And at the heart of that, it really comes down to what is the relationship between employee and employer? Like, where does that relationship kind of take shape? Like, what is the shape of that relationship? What is the structure of that? Like, and what'll help with that? Unionization, setting clear standards on how promotions are giving out, having an open wage system where everybody knows what everybody's making. So it's a lot less likely that one individual person will reap the benefits of undue compensation for special favors or special things that they're willing to do for someone in a position of power. These are real ways that you address issues of sexual harassment and unfairness and inequity inside of the workplace. Dragging every individual guy who's abused his power, dragging them through the mud is not really going to achieve the accomplished effect that you want to achieve it. Because, I'm going to be honest with you, it's not just straight men that are sexually harassing people. It's not just gay men that are sexually harassing people. It's any person with power has the ability to do this based on the structure of employee and employer.
I think you bring up an interesting point. I was a little worried about where you were going to start there, but where you went made total sense. I think that you bring up an interesting point, and I think that's part of why you've seen the public part of the celebrities being dragged over this stuff, and some politicians, a few anyway, but that you haven't really seen any sort of significant change in the way this is being handled in the workplace that most people are going to every day. Because the relationship between the employee and the employer isn't something that people actually want to look at. They'd rather we focus on these individual actors in the individual cases. And while they do deserve much of our attention in that they help highlight a deeper, more pervasive problem, it's going to take more than what we've seen so far to actually do anything to address the underlying issues and the how widespread it is at every level, from McDonald's all the way up the corporate ladder.
Yeah, I mean, and to a certain degree, some things are just very, very difficult to deal with, right? Like, obviously, the way we interact with people on a psychological level, like if somebody's good looking, there's an assumption that they do a better job than someone who's less good looking. Sometimes it's just harder to control for stuff like that. However, again, if you have clear standards, you've worked this position for this many years, or you've gotten this, you're able to perform these things, and you can move up to the next level after such amount of time, sort of like they do kind of like in the military, and it seems like it's sucky because if you're really talented, it slows you down. But one thing it does do, having clear standards like that, and maybe not exactly mirroring the military system, because obviously there's a lot of favoritism played there too, right? But maybe if you can figure out a way of having some sort of just system, or just get into the mindset of trying to structure something that's more just than what we have, I think we can get a long way in really addressing some of these issues. And I think, like I said before, having open compensation, like everybody knows what everybody's making in the same role. So like if you work as an engineer, if you're engineer 1, 2, or 3, all of you guys know what the salary range and the pay of everybody who works engineer 1, 2, and 3. Everybody knows, if you're a manager, what everybody who has a tank rank of, manager 1 or whatever manager that you are, like the same level, everybody on the same level knows what each other's making. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, truth be told, it should just be open where everybody knows what everybody makes.
Well, we've constructed a society that it's uncouth and impolite to even mention or talk about how much money you make. So, I mean, there's a large distance between where we are now and where that would make sense to a lot of people, I think.
But who benefits from people not sharing information? Because first off, what I want to say to you is that
poor performers.
Yeah, like it benefits you, people who feel that you're fairly paid for the work that you do. It benefits you to know, for that information just to be out there. It's nothing but beneficial to you for that information to be out there. The only reason why we've been socialized into being secret is because only in secrecy can corruption really, really, really kind of work its way in, and favoritism really start working its way in. Favors for, sex for promotions and things like that. That's how it really is able to operate, because so much of the stuff is in secrecy. When you have it out in the open, it's a lot harder to do that kind of stuff because everybody sees it. And I will tell you a story. There's a person I know that was a comptroller, and he said, 3 people in this one department, this is at a plant, were supposed to get a raise. But only 3 people in the department. Well, I said 3 people, but I meant to say 4 people that were in the department, but only 3 people were marked to get raises. For whatever reason, the manager didn't want to give one person a raise. But because the person is the person that processes payments and approvals for things of that nature, it's going to go across their desk that they got a raise and a bonus, and that person got 0. So because the manager wanted to be unfair to somebody, but because the other person would see that unfairness and know specifically that they were being treated unfairly, he had to treat that person fairly as well and give them whatever they were due. Even if it's not the same amount, something that they wouldn't be unhappy with. And I think that stands as an example of where having something in the open makes people less likely to try to screw you over.
Oh, absolutely. But I mean, a lot of people are in the position they are because they were the best at doing that, at screwing people over. I mean, most of society was built on that premise. I mean, you know, the mediocre white man or whatever, the part of society that allowed that segment of society to flourish and to succeed was predicated on that. And even some of the, we mentioned earlier unions and how they can help address some of these things, that they weren't also invincible or immune to it happening within their organizations. So,
well, so you know, the fall of unions, you know, that's probably something that we can go over. But, you know, I basically had a conversation with somebody about this, about why, you know, our unions failed. And really what it came down to is they just weren't very democratic institutions. They were corruptible, and they ended up mirroring the very same institutions that they were meant to guard against. They ended up mirroring their structures and their flaws. And then when you end up in a situation like that, and you are no longer responsive to the membership, and you no longer care about the membership, and there's no real control, the membership is not invested, you know, in the union being where it is, you know, you sort of set yourself up to be destroyed. And I think that's kind of what happened to the unions. Whereas you see in other countries that have still strong unions, there's a lot more democratic control over how those unions function. There's a lot more institutional support for those unions because of what they did. And one example would be unions in Europe, instead of fighting for the rights of their own individual members, meaning fighting for the right to be treated better than others, they fought for the rights of every worker. And because of that, you know, they also created institutions where they represented the workers, you know, whether you are a member or not. You know, that's something that's very different in those countries versus the United States, where our unions were kind of like, you know, you're going to basically join a select club, and this club allows you to get these benefits, and we're only going to fight for better benefits for our members. If you work in a different industry, or if you work, you know, in something that's not even related, you get nothing because the union doesn't cover that. And I think that's kind of what opened the door for them really to be destroyed. Also, you know, here in America, we got racism, and of course, racism plays into it. Union versus non-union, you can divide and conquer that. But then on top of that, even within the unions, you want to divide people based upon race. You want to not represent,
and sexism,
you know, the oppressed.
We started talking about sexual assault, but I was just going to mention sexism is prevalent within unions as well. But continue.
Okay, yeah. I mean, all the isms, whatever, you know, all that stuff that kind of plays in allows you to further divide people. You know, unions, because of their structures, they weren't really able to really resist being corrupted and then ultimately destroyed because of those flaws.
And you mentioned democratic control, and I think part of what we see across all of these organizations or groups is it's not just the democratic control, but it takes democratic engagement. There's a want within people that we've seen displayed, or a pattern of disengagement from our system, thinking that, well, okay, we got some good people in charge. We'll just let them do their thing, and I don't have to pay much attention to it. I don't have to stay very engaged with it. I'm doing well, so I can pay attention elsewhere. And and that allows for some of the things that you were just talking about.
I actually think that that's okay. I think it is okay for you to not be engaged at times, as long as there's mechanisms in place for once you have been woken up that you want to do something about it. As long as there's a mechanism in place by which basically the power will rest with the people when they decide to exercise it, as long as it's still like that, I think that's not as bad. It would be better if everybody remained engaged all the time, but you can't expect everybody to be fully engaged, you know, in multiple aspects, like all the time. People live lives, they want to be happy, and it's a very grueling work, right? We live in a society where, you know, that kind of time commitment, you know, let's say you have to be involved in your union. You also need to be involved in politics. You also have to be involved in school. You have to be involved in this. It's like there's a lot of stuff to be involved in just to be a citizen, you know, right? So it's okay if you don't exercise full engagement all the time. But what does need to happen is, let's say the union makes a horrible mistake or something like that. There needs to be, okay, we can get in here, call people up, get the votes. Oh, all the people that made that decision are out, and get our people in, or we can overturn the decision. Like the real power and direction of the union has to be basically resting with the actual membership. And I think that's something that's not in place now. Some unions are structured that way, but a lot of them, you know, basically the union people, or the people that actually make decisions in the union, you know, they're not even obligated to actually go with the voting voices of the membership. They can just go against it and do whatever. And there's nothing really you can do about it. And there's not even good mechanisms in place by which the membership can overturn their decisions. And then on top of that, I would require that, let's say you're a nurses union, right? I'll require that the nurses union be somebody that's an actual nurse that worked in the industry and is elected by their peers to lead the union. That would be a better change than having like professional CEOs or professional lobbyists be the union head, and they're not really tied to the union. They're not even tied to the job function in any way, shape, or form. They're just a paid person that's taking a super high salary for whatever reason, and they identify more with the oppressors than the people they're supposed to be representing, the oppressed. And I think that that's a huge problem. So one way to do that would be to have requirements like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can't speak to the example that comes to my mind of a union leadership kind of flouting what its members might have wanted would be some political endorsements from 2016. But outside of that, I'm not too familiar with situations where you had a union members by and large of one opinion and the leadership doing something different and them being incapable through a lack of mechanisms to change that behavior. But
yeah, I think those endorsements stand as a prime example. But if if they're happening there, they're happening in other areas as well.
Yeah. I suspect that there's just that the unions are making large mistakes, but it's not so much that there isn't a mechanism for people to be able to act, but that they haven't been rallied to action and have it pointed out in a way that explains to them why they need to. And I mean, I don't know, maybe there are some big union instances that I'm missing, and I guess I'll take a peek at that. But
yeah, that has been I think the structure of the unions where you have CEOs and some of these things are like dynasties. You had what's that, Jimmy Hoffa's son, or like he becomes the head of the union because his dad was the head of the union, and he kind of like has like a little dynasty there, but he doesn't actually work. He hasn't worked in that industry. He's just like a union lead because his dad was a union lead. That's kind of bullshit. Like there needs to be somebody elected from the membership that actually worked the job.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. And I guess Hoffa is an example of whether there was opposition to that, whether it was voiced or not, may have had more to do with the type of leadership that was being used rather than whether there was actual opposition. So, but I mean, I look at our democracy also, and I think of that we were talking before the show, before we started recording, that the Congress is actually quite powerful, but it's our divisions among us that keep us from being able to actuate what we want. And so, like, I think if people were more engaged, if people were in the streets, and people were doing things, I think that the power is there. But if we're not, then the mechanisms are somewhat useless. Is how I feel. But I do take your point as to where they don't exist. It makes it virtually impossible.
Yeah, I mean, and that's actually a good segue. We're going to go ahead and get off of this, but I felt like that was something that I just didn't see a lot of angles discussing when they talked about sexual harassment. Number one, they focused too much on like the emphasis on white males, when I know, like, sure, white males are dominant, but there are females that are also powerful and dominant as well that could also be using their power. And it's particularly when we're talking about the entertainment industry, where sex sells, like that industry runs on sex. That I mean, you have to really change the dynamics of that industry to really start seeing a lot of changes there. Like, you have to think these are some of the, better looking people, from our society that kind of matriculate up to that, and they aspire to be a star and things of that nature. And people with power, not even with power, people with the know-how or the illusion of power are able to basically predate on those people. They're basically able to prey on them. So I think that's something that we really need to start addressing. And part of that is making sure that employees have strong rights that are represented collectively by a union. And then also at the same time, people not living in such a desperate situation that they're willing to do things like that just to try to get ahead in like a dog eat dog world. Like, if there was more of a federal guaranteed job, like, you're not going, if you don't get this gig, you're not going to eat. So you got to do whatever you got to do to make sure you get the gig. And that just opens you up to things that you would normally not be opened up to, otherwise. So these are all reasons why I think, like, at the bottom line, the relationship between employer and employee just needs to be addressed. And there's many ways you can come and really get in there and do that. But I think those are some ways off the top of my head that would help us. But you brought up an interesting point. So let's make a segue. We're going to move on and kind of try to talk a little bit about the government, because I feel like we have, when we come to politics, it's a common thing for me to hear, individual perspectives, individual things, like individual evidence of something, like an individual instance of something as like a standing evidence. That means, like, all the studies and following, hundreds of thousands of people, like this individual thing means everybody can do it. And I think this is so pervasive that it might need to be in the schools, like the public schools, like that. Bottom line, like, that's not how any of this works. Like, none of it works that way. Just because it works for you doesn't mean it'll work for somebody else. Like, at a basic level, sheer logic should be able to tell you that for every opportunity that you're given and you take advantage of, that's an opportunity thousands or hundreds of thousands of people just didn't get. So you start running the numbers on that, like people getting opportunities, and it's a pyramid, right? It's scaled. You go up, you got this opportunity, but you didn't get that one. So you go down. One person got high. Somebody's going to get everything to line up for them, and they're going to matriculate all the way up to the top. Somebody else is going to get everything but one thing, and they're going to matriculate all the way up to the top, but the second level, and so on and so on and so on. But on the opposite side of that, right, is a mirrored image. There's an underside. Let's say you started off at 0, you make one bad mistake, and you go down one level. Or you can have a string of bad mistakes. And I'm saying mistakes like it's actually your choices, right? I'm talking about circumstances. You live in a certain circumstance that's beyond your control. You can go all the way to the bottom very quickly, and it has nothing to do with you. So understanding that that's how the world really functions, based off of luck and random chance first, then your individual choices second, is, I think, paramount to really starting to get us to have a mindset by which we can start having just government and a just society.
The meritocracy is so important to maintaining, to keep us from, having a mental breakdown thinking about all of the people that are hungry or without home or houses, and with a variety of other unfortunate circumstances. That, the idea is, well, it was mistakes that they made somehow that led them there, rather than a society that I benefit and contribute towards, that has resulted in their exploitation and their misfortune. Like,
yeah, I mean, the way I think about it, I think of it like almost like a binary tree. You have a situation and you have two outcomes, good or bad, and of course there's varying degrees, right? But we're not going to go in there. Let's just say it's all good or all bad. You get 5 goods in a row, you're at the maximum end. You get 5 bads in a row, you're on the negative, maximum negative end, right? Now, most people are not going to be on one of those two sides. They're going to be some combination, right? So they can be a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, good or bad, in either direction, based on nothing that they had control over themselves, just based on the situation that they are in from the jump that's beyond their control. And I think we just have to start thinking of it like that.
Geography is an easier one to think of. It is, were you born in, on the coasts or in the middle of the country? Were you born in the U.S. or were you born in, Mongolia, or were you born in, Chile or Chile, or were you born, that's an easy one that
are
can have
you born into a dominant group or a racially oppressed group?
Exactly. And then once you pick a location, then you can start, were you born into a wealthy family or into a poor family? Were you born
I have to actually answer this. Can you talk for a second for me, Richard?
No problem. And were you born into a wealthy family? Were you born into a poor family? Were you born with disabilities or without disabilities? Were you born, granted with other gifts like vocal talent or, a variety of other, physical embodiments of, sports talent or something else? All of those things contribute to where you get placed on that scale that Nick was describing, before you have had any input into your life whatsoever. And while you may be able to move around on that scale, once you get to start putting input on it, if we don't recognize how that starting place affects your future, then we're not being honest with ourselves, and we're not going to be able to make the kind of progress that we need to make. And so
go ahead, bring me back in.
Okay, go ahead, Nick. You can come back on in. I wasn't sure.
Okay, I'm sorry about that, guys. I actually am expecting an important call later on today. I was hoping that it wouldn't occur, while we're actually doing our show. But and I want to apologize. Like I said before, normally we would do this show live, but we've had some scheduling conflicts, so we haven't been able to do it. So we got to decide to go ahead and have a conversation anyway, record it, and put it up on the channel for you guys to view at your leisure. And I find that I get most of my views that way anyway, so it shouldn't be too bad. But we're going to try to get back to the live format, as best we can, probably sometime around the start of the new year, 2018.
Yeah, I just want to mention quickly we're a similar situation at the Discourse with scheduling, it being what it is, and a lot of people having life come at them very fast. It's we're doing the best we can, and we want to be putting out more content out there as well. So you'll be seeing more on the Discourse SoundCloud, and then possibly, hopefully, on the YouTube channel in the near future. Go ahead and get back into it, Nick.
Okay, I think you probably you saw what I was trying to describe with that. I'm not familiar with everybody, whether or not like a binary tree. That was probably a bad example to use, but I'm just thinking like left or right, and then like the further left you are, the better your outcomes, and the further right you are, the better your outcomes. You're not actually making decisions. It's just like objectively looking at your situation. Where do you fall on this scale? And you can go all the way to the left, all the way to the right, like everything lined up for you or it didn't. And based on that, like your situation is very, very different. And that's not something that just happens one time in your life. That's something that happens constantly, over and over and over again. Are you in the right time at the right place? Did you speak to the right person at the right time? What did they think about you arbitrarily? That had nothing to do with anything you did. They could have just been having a bad day. Maybe they had a bad day and they interviewed you, and because of that, they were in a bad mood. They didn't hire you. Like, what did you wore green. They don't like the color green. Maybe they have some kind of racial insensitivities that made them just not like you because of the color of your skin. You don't decide these things. But all of these things really have a huge, positive or detrimental effect on where you end up in life. And so because we understand that that's how it works, well, we should understand that that's how it works. There's another thing that should be, again, in the school system, so everybody can just drop meritocracy right off the bat, because it's a complete farce. Like, it has nothing to do with anything.
And like I said, people don't want to come to grips or tackle the idea that they're contributing to a society that allows the exploitations of people to the point where you have hungry kids, veterans without houses that are killing themselves at ridiculous rates. But, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think key to doing this part, another reason, I'm sorry. Guys, obviously, you can see I haven't done this in a long time. I'm tripping over my words here because I'm trying to get someplace, and I'm trying to formulate how do I get there while I'm talking. And that's called narration. That's a skill. Obviously, I haven't been using mine. It's very dusty and rusty, right? So let's dust it off and let's get it together. Key to having a better society or having better politics in general is understanding the role of the public sector in your life. And I don't just mean the public schools that educate your children. I don't just mean the police that keep you safe, or the firefighters that come to put out fires, or running water. I mean, really understanding what the public sector does for you. Like, everybody, if you are an employer, how did you get your goods and services to market? Where are you selling your goods and services? What market is there? Markets don't exist without rules. Rules are set by the government. Without the government, there is no market. Without the market, there is no product that you're bringing to market. You don't have anything that you have without government. But everybody wants to think I did all this on my own. It's like, no. Government set up institutions and structures that you were able to take advantage of to get to where you are. So it's not something that you can do without government. And you're always going to have some libertarian asshat. Not going to lie. There's always going to be one. Well, you can do some things without government. And I'm going to be like, well, if you really want to function without government, you have to be living out by yourself in the middle of nowhere with nothing. All you have is whatever you do for yourself. That's somebody who's living without government, literally. And guess what? When you're out there all by yourself without government, you know what you are? Food for people with governments. They're just going to come and eat you. You got nothing to protect you. You got no military. You got nothing to defend yourself. They can just come take your land. You know, oh, you're not living in a country, you know, right? There's nothing to defend you. You're just food for whoever. Whoever's stronger than you, they just come out and take advantage. But again, you live in America. You don't have to worry about that because we have a military. They'll defend you or defend certain things. Or, you know, if you're very, very wealthy, they protect your product. You want to ship product around the world, you don't have to worry about piracy because guess what? This is an American ship. If you report piracy to the Navy, they will actually go and try to hunt the pirates down and protect commerce. You know, that piracy was a big deal back in the day, but governments had their Navy patrolling to make sure that ships were, you know, safe to travel basically and be free of piracy.
Yeah. I mean, it's, I think what some of the libertarians and I think what some of the corporate class would think is that they can afford their own. And I think that's where where they would like to see things. I think if you ask the corporate class, the top 1% of the 1%, if you ask them what they'd want, basically corporate thievedoms, and perhaps there would be, you know, battles between them, but they essentially a government without the pesky interference of the governed.
So here's what I'll say to them. I don't think any corporation really wants to pay the true cost of the benefits that they receive from government. They don't want to pay that.
No.
Like Microsoft wouldn't even exist without government. So like, you know, the idea of an operating system wouldn't exist. The idea of the car being widespread, the automotive industry just wouldn't exist if the government didn't build roads for the cars to ride on, right? Like a lot of this stuff, like you would owe everything. So if you want to pay the full cost of those things, those it would be quite an exorbitant cost.
Yeah, I mean, I think IP has a particular place in the market versus like commodities. I think commodities are a bit easier to handle in an imaginary governmentless market, but IP is definitely going to be difficult. But and I think you're right in that they don't want to bear the true cost of actually, you know, paying for roads or.
I don't think they can afford it.
Well, I mean, to a degree, they're kind of paying for it as it is.
No.
Like, I mean, they obviously the labor produces the surplus value, and they're merely, you know, taking it and then putting some of it back into the system. But essentially, the money, like they're not just keeping it; they do still contribute enough money so that the roads are passable enough to continue moving the goods, so that the people can.
No. But there's a disproportionate benefit,
yes.
right?
Yes. Yeah.
So like what they pay compared to how they benefit, and in terms of if you tried to put a dollar amount on that, they wouldn't be able to function paying that and still be profitable.
No,
like
I think
like you're talking about margins that would be so razor thin that like it wouldn't be the same. Like I honestly don't believe that any of these corporations can really afford to pay for all the things and services that they actually get from government, to pay the full cost of those things.
And I think what you see with the concentration of wealth that we've been seeing is that they don't know what's good for them. Alan Greenspan came to this realization a little too late, and I think many corporations are, like, you know, he said that the financial industry will regulate themselves. They wouldn't do something so ridiculous as to, you know, basically plunge us into a great recession. That would never happen.
Yeah, but I mean,
but so the same thing with these corporations is like they don't, like, I think you're right that if they actually had to bear the true cost of securing all of their property without a government and having some sort of and still selling their goods or services in the world that would result without the government that they, you know, that they're constantly in battle with, if you want to envision it that way, being the representative of people, even if they don't want that, if they actually thought about it, they wouldn't want it, but they're not that wise that they will lead themselves right into that trap, and they will allow themselves to destroy the government in such a way that it would negatively impact their own businesses.
Yeah. So, I mean, back to your comment about Alan Greenspan, what a tool anyway. But
I mean,
when you
he
say
was
like the financial
the
structure
mind,
will
but
regulate itself, they wouldn't do something so ridiculous. I agree. Individual financial institutions probably wouldn't do something so destructive that it would destroy themselves. But what you have when you have institutions that are locked together like that, and they're all kind of doing similar things, is there's kind of like a mob mentality, like they all start doing certain things, and capitalism itself, by the way it works, kind of incentivizes each of them to try to outdo the other in bad behavior. And since each of them is doing it, it becomes like a systemic issue where each individual person by themselves is not necessarily doing something wrong, but the collective of all of them doing something creates a systemic issue where it's really, really bad. And the best way I can show this is, let's say we have people. In order for somebody to buy, somebody has to sell, right? In order for a system to work, somebody has to buy and somebody has to sell. If we're talking about trading goods, we're having commerce, right? What if at any point in time, one guy says, well, you know what? I'm not going to buy anymore. I need to save my money. And then another guy, I'm not going to buy anymore either. He's not buying. I'm not buying. Individually, one person saving and not buying, not spending their money, basically, doesn't mean anything. But if collectively enough people do that, now nobody's buying stuff. So now people who are trying to sell stuff can't sell. The whole system becomes paralyzed because there's been a systemic issue. There's not enough buyers. And basically sellers either have to make all these weird decisions trying to sell their goods and services. But basically what you come to is a systemic collapse, right? Because individually, everybody can do whatever they want to do. But when you put it collectively, all the people doing things that individually might not have been an issue, when they collectively do it, it becomes a really, really big deal. And it's the same thing that you have with the finance sector. And that same dynamic can be expanded and basically implanted on multiple things. You want to give a tax break for a corporation to move to your zone? That's fine. Guess what? Somebody else is going to compete now. So now they want to give a tax break. Now everybody's giving tax breaks till it gets to the point where, okay, how much benefit is the locality receiving? Everybody's giving tax breaks. Now they're basically racing to the bottom, right? It doesn't really benefit them anymore to draw the companies there because they're not really benefiting from the company being there because they're not taxing them.
Yeah, exactly. They will
anything for all the infrastructure and stuff that they would need to have the company.
They'll do it till they get to the point that they're actually losing, that it's not even a benefit, that they've bid themselves out of it being a profitable endeavor in the first place. Because while we like to think we're rational actors, as you point out, once these patterns start to develop, it becomes about winning, and it becomes about other aspects, and it doesn't even have anything to do with the net benefit to the people.
And guess what? It may be rational. It may be rational for you individually, an individual institution or an individual place to do that. But what happens when everybody does it? When everybody does it, now we have a problem because everybody can't do that. And this is just basic stuff. Everybody can't do the same thing, right? And let's take it all the way back to when I first started this conversation. We have too much emphasis on the individual. Like I will repeat that. When you're making laws, when you're making policy, when we're talking politics, it's not about individuals. It's about the collective. Now, of course, there's limits, right? We don't want to go too far to the collective because, obviously, you're going too far in any direction is probably a bad thing, right? You want to protect some individual rights and stuff. But when we're talking about, hey, this is how this works, or in this circumstance, this is what happens, you don't use the exception. You don't use an individual instance of something going a certain way and saying, well, that applies to everybody. It's like, maybe it does apply to everybody for them individually one time in that same circumstance. Not everybody's in that same circumstance. And we're trying to make rules that will apply to everybody. And if everybody was in that same circumstance, it works, but everybody's not, so it doesn't work. So what works for one person can't be applied to everybody, the collective as a whole. Those are two totally different viewpoints. And I think that the reason why I'm spending so much time talking about this is because I see it time and time again. When I talk to people about politics, there's too much emphasis on the individual. And I think that's by design. And there's not enough thought about, like, okay, while this may benefit me individually, it's not necessarily good for everybody as a whole. Or if everybody did exactly what I did, it doesn't work that way. It can't.
I mean, littering is one that comes to my mind. It's something. Just kind of to give a visualization to the idea is, if I think about littering, and if on my way to work I throw out one small piece of garbage every time I drive, because it's just one little piece of thing, and it prevents it from cluttering up my car, and it makes sense for me, and it's biodegradable, even though if it takes 6 months to a year to biodegrade, or and it's like, so I just do this one. I do it on my way to work. It's like 5 times a week. Little pieces of garbage, not a big deal. Everything will be taken care of. But if everybody is throwing out one piece of small garbage, and all of them take 6 months to a year to biodegrade, then the sides of the roads start to build up berms of garbage pretty quickly. And so, like, that's one way for me to visualize what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, and we can just give examples on this all day. We can just give examples on this all day. Like, it should be clear that you operating as an individual are not indicative of anything that should be your individual circumstance is not indicative of anything that should be applied to everyone wholesale, because you live in specific circumstances that apply to you, just as they live in specific circumstances that apply to them. What we need to do is start figuring out what happens for the mass of people. Like, we can generalize people's circumstance to a great degree and understand certain situations. There are some universal things, like everybody needs water. If you're human, you have to drink water. So we can say that if you don't have water, most people would die. There might be somebody who has a weird mutation somewhere else where they don't have to drink water, but we don't make rules. We don't find that one person and say, ha ha, I found one person that doesn't need to drink water. So that means everybody else doesn't need to drink water. That's not how that works.
I know somebody that was like, was very anti-water. Not that they wouldn't drink anything that contained water, but never just plain water. ever.
Yeah, but I'm just trying to think of like the most ridiculous assumption and put it in perspective. Like, this is what I hear when I talk to people. Well, when I think about it, my whole life has been an example of this. Well, your whole life doesn't apply to everybody, buddy. Like, I can look at these studies here and it says, hey, we've followed families from the 1600s to today, and the people who were rich back then are rich now. We've studied using census data and tax returns, data from the IRS, and we can see that, like, where your parents are and your grandparents, where they were, that has a direct correlation to where you are today. It's more indicative than any decisions that you may have made. But yet people still want to believe, hey, I have agency. I have control over my own life. Like, I'm in perfect control. It's all about my choices. Like, no, it's not. It's not about your choices. It's not about your individual life. But again, like you said, nobody wants to hear that, they're subject to things that they just don't have the control over. But I'm like, well, you walk outside, you get the weather every day, right? Is it going to be sunny? Is it going to be partly cloudy? Is it going to rain? You don't control the weather. You're subject to the weather. The economy is the same thing. The laws of the land are about the same thing at an individual level.
Well, and I mean, the movie Geostorm comes to my mind, in that we don't control the weather, but we want to. Like, we want to control everything, even the things that we can't control. Like, and so shifting that dynamic, I think, is a heavy task. And I think you mentioned earlier that we need to get these things taught in schools, and to me, that's more or less where I find myself more and more frequently, is that if we actually want to fix these things, it's going to have to start with helping kids understand them in a way that most adults aren't, rather than convincing adults to understand them the way as you're describing them, whether it's the disable or destroying the myth of the meritocracy or the other aspects that we've been discussing so far.
Okay, let's I want to talk about the tax bill a little bit. Like, everybody already has seen the details on the tax bill. I don't need to talk about why it's bad. I mean, how terrible it is. But I want to understand, before we even begin to talk about taxes, like, at the federal level, what is taxes? What does taxes do? What does taxation do? I want to hear what you think, Richard. I'm gonna give my take. It's not a right or wrong answer here.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, one of the things about taxation is whether taxation is used for spending or not. And I think most people are under the assumption that we take in tax money and then spend the tax money, but that's not how taxation works. I don't know if you're going to go into that in more detail.
Yeah. I mean, well, go ahead. I mean, you're already there. I don't need to double back over you.
I wouldn't. I wouldn't say that I'm good at describing it. So
okay. Well, let me come in and I'm gonna basically double down on what you just said. You know, at the federal level, first off, let's understand what money is. Money is not a fixed resource. It's not like a fixed thing that you have a set amount of it and like you can just run out at any point in time. Money is an abstracted thing, and abstraction is something humans sometimes have a hard time with. You know, don't know why, but like it's kind of complicated. If you can't see it, feel it, touch it, like and relate it to something that's real, it's difficult for us. But we need to understand that money is not like a fixed resource that has like a limit on it. Like there's no limit to the amount of money we can have in the world. What money is like oil in your car. It's lubricant so that the economy can perform its functions. If we didn't have money as a store of value and a means of exchange, then it would be really difficult for us to exchange goods and services amongst one another. You know, because if I don't want fish and that's all you have, you can't buy from me. And I sell, I don't know, shoes. But if you go and you want to sell fish to somebody and all he's willing to give you is a vest and I don't want a vest, how do we all change like the different things that each of us wants without having some sort of universal form or universal currency, uniform currency, uniform means of exchange and value that we can use to do that, to make that happen? That's everybody understands that, like, that's what money really serves. The problem is what everybody thinks is like it's a fixed resource. Like the government, they see the government as a user of money. The government is not a user of money. Banks are not a user of money. The government and banks are creators of money. So those institutions create money. When you see them having these budgets and things of that nature, and they say we're going to spend this amount on this, they're not checking their money and going. They're not checking their books and going, okay, the government has this amount of money. And so we're going to spend this amount and then we got to borrow the different. No. They literally create whatever they want to spend. When they spend money, they spend it into existence. It's just keystrokes on a keyboard, the money's there. And people will say, well, you know, every time they do that, you know, they're lowering the value of money. That's a misunderstanding of how money works. If a billionaire walks in the room, you and I, Richard, we're in the room. Mm-hmm. We have $20 in our pocket and we're buying beer. If a billionaire walks in the room, our money has not changed in value. Whatever we could buy with that $20 is still the exact same thing we can buy with that $20. That is not some kind of weird, you know, like there's no instant valuation. Like, a billionaire just walked in the room, so everybody's money is now worth less. That's not how that works. If you're talking about like how prices change, they have to have conditions. So let's talk about some of the conditions where prices might change. If you have people who have money and they're all wanting to buy something, but there's not enough of the certain thing that they want. So if everybody wants a soda, but there's only 5 sodas and 10 people that want it, now there's a scarcity involved. And based on that scarcity, the seller of that soda will say, I can charge individuals more as a means of dealing with the scarcity. And as people have different means, the person who's willing to bid the most money or the person who has the most money to bid, generally they're the same person, right? That person will be able to buy the soda, you know, and the people who don't have that much money or are unwilling to spend that money on that item will not buy the soda. That's just a way of dealing with scarcity. And that's still not inflation, so to speak, in a classical sense. That's like a demand pull inflation or supply driven inflation. You have money chasing, you have more money or the same amount of money chasing fewer goods, demand pull inflation. And for some reason, people seem to think that occurs just merely by a billionaire or there being more money out there. It's like, it doesn't really work that way. Really what it works is goods and services are either basically the price of those goods and services will move up based upon how much they have in supply versus how much demand for that particular good or service is. And no matter how rich I am, I'm only going to buy so many pairs of shoes. So like my money actually grows or the money supply grows, but people are still buying the same amount of stuff that they were buying before. You know, there's not really a need for inflation. Only when you have people wanting to buy either more goods or they have more money to spend on those goods. Could there be a bidding war, you know, based on the limitation of the supply? And since we don't control the supply, that's how you start getting inflation, right? And I try to keep it as simple as possible. Obviously, there's other forms of inflation, but it's not just merely, the point I want you to take away from that is it's not just merely more money in circulation. It has to be like more money in actual people's hands who are actually buying goods and services. If somebody puts their money in the bank, it's gone. It's not in the economy anymore. It's just sitting in a bank. Banks don't lend out the deposits. Remember, they spend into existence, right? They loan into existence. So they're not actually spending out of their deposits. When you put money in a bank, it's leaked from the economy. It's no longer there for all intents and purposes. When you pay taxes to your locality, at the national level, that money is not back into the economy. That money is gone. So just like they spend into existence, you tax out of existence. And so like the idea that you're like transferring money from one person to another, it's not really true. Those are two separate transactions and not related to one another. And I know I just said a whole bunch of stuff trying to be complete. What do you think as far as me being clear when I explained all that? Or tried to give like a rough overview as best I could?
Well, I think it helps. I think it's hard to, like you said, with abstract concepts, it's hard for people to quite put their mind around it. And I think you know, people, some of the things that would come up to me that I would want explanations on would be something like, all right, so like how does this play at something like, you know, exclusive or high-end places or whatever. So like you know, being able to charge, you know, $10 or more for a beer at a festival or something like that. So, you know, you mentioned a billionaire coming into the room doesn't affect the people with $20 in their pocket. But what if that billionaire says, well, you know, I know like there's 5 sodas and I only really want one, but I'll pay $20 for a soda. And then the person that's selling can now then demands $20 from everybody, or no, they don't get a soda and they just wait for the billionaire to buy another soda later instead of selling each soda for significantly less.
Okay. So prices are a little bit sticky.
Mm-hmm.
And this is talked about a lot. Like you'll see people talk about prices as being kind of sticky. So there's an intrinsic real value on items and goods, and the price will tend to be dragged towards that, barring some sort of outside force. And those usually outside forces are things like monopoly and things of that nature, regulations, and truth be told, just perception. So like you have to say, if I was buying a soda for $5 for 4, and then all of a sudden the price jumps to 20 because one guy pays $20 for a soda. The question is, am I also going to pay $20 for a soda? Whereas before I can get 4 sodas for my 20? You know, is that a likely scenario? Like, are there groups of billionaires that can just do this all the time? You know, it's really not just like a cut and dry kind of thing. There's scenarios in there, because what we're talking about here is an individual example, but really prices are set sometimes according to large numbers of people, right? So like, and there's other factors going on. Why can't we just go somewhere else and buy the beer? Yeah.
And I think that's you mentioned regulations, and I think that sometimes that's not how people don't see regulations affecting them or businesses around them in that way, in influencing how something can be priced in the market and so on and so forth. And so,
well, remember, all markets are dictated by rules, and those rules are set by laws. And so like there is, you know, basically the government is the end all be all in markets.
Yeah,
because they set the rules.
We have net neutrality coming, and so I think that's going to be one of those.
Yeah, but I mean, even net neutrality, like by saying we're not going to regulate how you do something, you're setting a rules of saying it's going to be lawless in some aspect or form. So now the big players get to set the rules however they want to, because there is an absence of rules by the government in that particular area. So it's still structured in a way by government. The absence of rules or the inclusion of rules is still government controlling the structure.
And so it'll just be interesting to see how that plays out with whether we know traditionally the idea is that they're going to make us pay for different access to different websites. So are they going to go after the websites? Or are they going to go after the Netflixes and the Googles and the major net traffics, and trying to charge them, and then let them figure out how they're going to pass that cost along to their customers, or are the ISPs going to go directly to the consumers? And if they go to the large industries, then that's going to have it's going to play out differently than if they go to the consumers, because then consumers will have more influence on what websites are able to have a higher speed traffic, because they're going to be the ones paying the subscriptions, versus if it's from things that we're already accustomed to, something like Google doing it and then passing the cost down along to us through a mechanism that way, that we're going to just go off of what our pattern behavior as it is already.
Well, I mean, I can't say how. I mean, I'm not into that space enough to say how that's all going to play out. Mm-hmm. But what I can tell you is, those with power and influence will use that to twist things to their advantage, and to general people who are individuals, you're not very powerful. So let's be under no illusion that whatever outcome comes from this, the powerful will be protected and the weak will be punished, and if you're an individual, just a consumer, let's be understanding. And when I say the weak, I mean us, we will be punished and the powerful will be protected in that outcome. But let's roll back. Mm-hmm. The point that we want to talk about taxation. Mm-hmm. And what it does. So like, if taxation is not if government doesn't tax people to pay for the programs because taxation and its expenditures are not related in that way, what is taxation for? And I think it's really for the modification of incentives. So it incentivizes people to do something. If you want to work out and be healthy, I will give you a tax break to encourage you to work out and be healthy, or I'll give you a tax break on the cost of your gym membership to encourage that behavior. Or if you want to pollute, I will fine you, or I will charge you higher taxes, or I will levy a tax upon that behavior that you're doing that's not necessarily not necessarily wanted or desired. And believing that people will respond to these incentives in varying ways, sometimes that's enough to be able to deter the behavior. It actually, if you're using market forces, it can work that way, depending on what it is. And I think taxation plays an important role in making that happen. Also, at the same time, we have to remember taxation has a role in adjusting the structure of society, because behaviors, that you can alter with taxation, you can also alter outcomes. So think about it this way. If I don't want companies to treat employers like X, I can levy a tax on companies that do so. If I wanted companies to use their reserves to invest back in employees, or if I wanted them to, I can use the tax structure to basically force individuals and firms to not really coerce. You don't necessarily have to force them hard. You can coerce them to do things that you may seem that are just desirable for you to do, to make them do. You can just make them treat employees better. You can make them not pollute. You can make individuals do things that are healthy for them. Send their kids to school, eat healthier foods, buy homes that have energy efficient windows, increase the energy efficiency of their home, buy new cars, new more efficient, cars, not necessarily just a new car, period, right? Paying their local taxes. You can use the tax code to do a lot of stuff, but it appears, to somebody, I'm not a legislator, I'm not a lawyer, and I was looking at the job prospects for lawyers. I don't know why, but people are not becoming lawyers. Law schools are starting to have a lot of trouble. Enrollment's down. I don't know what that's about, but I was going to do some more research on that. But it appears to me that the basic premise of this new tax bill seems to be basically a restructuring of our society, or maybe not a restructuring, a continuation of its current structure, where it moves money, wealth in general, from individuals, poor, middle individuals, towards the highest echelons of our society. So it seems like it's built to enrich them at the same time impoverishing everybody else. And for the life of me, I cannot understand why everybody's okay with the corporate side of the tax cuts being permanent, but the individual side being temporary. Like, you have to get permanent corporate tax breaks and then temporary individuals. And then in order for it to be budget neutral, the temporary tax cuts have to disappear, but the corporate ones are here to stay. That's crazy. It doesn't make any sense to me. Like, that's the biggest shame I've ever seen. That's like a game. It's like they're just playing a game with you.
Well, I mean, and they're just putting it right out there. I mean, and they just recently, there was the Corker kickback coverage or whatever, and just basically finding out that in order to get people to sign on, that there's getting, or allegedly or not, whatever, but that they're basically putting in sweetheart deals specifically for certain people that is going to dramatically reduce in like certain groups of individuals' tax burden significantly. It's just buying people off in order to get them to pass what is essentially, you know, a huge wealth transfer from the most people to a very small segment at the top. And what's astonishing is that even among Republicans, it doesn't have a majority of support, or it's just barely. Or
but it's moving forward, isn't it?
Yeah,
it
doesn't
forward.
matter. Like I mean,
the public be damned. Like that, you don't matter.
Yeah, and net neutrality, this tax bill, they're basically looking they're looking the average people in the face and saying, do something. And people are like, well, I'm gonna tweet about it. And they're like, that's fine, we can mute those when we want. Like, we have total control over what you can and can't tweet. So you tweet all you want, as long as you just don't get out in the streets and actually, you know, start threatening people or make us get concerned that you're going to burn down the buildings we're in or anything like that. Then we'll just do whatever. We'll take you back as far as you'll let us until you actually do something about it. And that's where I see this what we're seeing with the tax bill, net neutrality, and what's going to be coming out forward with probably more conflict and possibly a war on the horizon. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like when we kind of thinking about this like tax bill, I'm just like, how does it just has so much staying power? Like, they don't care. You want to pretend this is about you. This isn't about you. Like, you are just there not really to participate in politics. You're there to kind of be like, you know, kind of like sitting around watching it all happen, and you're supposed to feel invested because you're watching it happen, but you're not a player. You're not in the game. There are people who are playing to win for big money. They're playing for themselves. They're not playing for you. And I think our investment into that as individuals, we want to believe that we have representation, you know, that it's just not there. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. Like, public opinion just really doesn't have much influence on where a particular policy goes, because you see very unpopular policies pass all the time, and very popular policies can't even get on the floor.
Oh, like, and there was that study not too long ago that came out that showed that public opinion has virtually no effect on policy.
But you know what? When you remind people of that, it's like they hear it and they say, yeah, you know, you're right about that. But, you know, it doesn't matter because it's still about what we think. It's like, no. This actually shows it doesn't matter what you think. What you think doesn't matter. But nobody wants to hear that they're in a dystopia. Like, you've been fed this, you know, hey, you know, our system isn't perfect, but it really does work. You've been fed this bullshit all your life. You know, and at a certain point, you have to be adult enough to say, well, that was just some bullshit. It just doesn't apply.
I mean, just to take a look around. Really take a look around. Like, you have people with tens of billions of dollars and yet you have hungry kids that are in debt to pay for school lunch, parents that can't afford to get the medical care, the dental care they need to, you know, in order to avoid missing work in the future. Like, it's obscene, let alone the disparities between the United States and the rest of the world. Like, it's atrocious. It's an abomination. It's horrible. And every day here we are. And I mean,
and let's talk about how tenacious this policy is. I want you to think about it. Every president that we have had has cut taxes in some way, shape, or form since Bill Clinton. Every president has cut taxes consistently. Every president has had some form of tax bill where he's given out tax breaks. Every last one of them. And here we are again, going for, round 2, 3, 4. We just this keeps coming back up, and it's because it's like it doesn't matter what you think about it. It's like these are policies that are going to happen because we have abdicated our responsibility to have responsive government. Like we have just let that go. We just let go of it. We're invested in whether there's a D or an R behind their name. Oh yeah, and for everybody else that wants to complain about Donald Trump's tax plan, I didn't see many of you complaining when Barack Obama passed a tax plan.
Lots of rationalization, justification for why he had to do it. And go ahead.
But wait a minute though, like everybody complained when Bush passed those tax cuts, but when Obama comes in and makes them permanent, nobody said anything. They rationalized it. Mm-hmm. They didn't say anything. Now Trump is coming and expanding the tax cuts on top of that, and now they're screaming bloody murder. But the question is, are you really concerned about the policy, or are you just concerned about who's doing it?
Well, we've seen whether it's drones or whether it's one thing after another that, when Obama did it, there was no scandals during the Obama administration, It was like, don't mind the 6-7 countries we're bombing, the many kids that are being starved. Don't mind that, don't mind the no DAPL protests or the water protectors that are getting hosed and shrapnel and like, don't mind none of that. It's Obama, but Trump starts doing it.
It seem like every time Donald Trump does something, I have to bring up Obama. But there's a reason why I do this. Obama may be gone, but his policies have lived on. His legacy is there, and now his record is there. And if I can't talk about somebody's record, we are truly in the wrong place. If I can't talk about somebody's record, like I should be able to bring up the record. And the reason why I bring up Obama is because Obama provides a context for Donald Trump. Obama's failures provided a political opening by which Donald Trump can just squeeze himself on in there. Like in many ways, Barack Obama had opportunities that he could have done things and he didn't. And those opportunities or those things that he didn't do provided opportunity for him to be attacked, or provided political will for there to be enough political will for him not to have a successor, for somebody to try something different, for people want to try something different. And everybody's got an explanation on this, and you've heard this ad nauseum. I'm not going to keep rehashing it, but I don't believe in just telling you this is happening today. I believe in saying this is how we got here. Here's the context by which we find ourselves. Because if you don't have context, facts can lie. I can just give you a fact, and without the context around that fact, I can just spin whatever. You can just be thinking whatever. You can have preconceived notions in your head to make you think something completely different from what the real truth is, even though I gave you factual information. This is basic. This is manufacturing consent. This is how propaganda works. This is very, very basic stuff. And I've talked about these things in prior episodes. I'm not going to rehash them, but I'm just going to tell you that like context is important. History is important. And I bet you a lot of people will be hard pressed to know that President Clinton passed tax cuts, President Bush passed tax cuts, President Obama passed tax cuts, and President Trump is now passing tax cuts. It's like when I say that all these presidents did these things, now it's going to be like, well, what's the minute differences in this and differences in that? If you understand that taxes are not for spending, the arguments about the deficit don't matter. But what does matter is who's benefiting mostly off these taxes. And it's been disproportionately the top of America. The top 5 to 1% to the 0.1% have been benefiting disproportionately off all these policies. And yet everybody, the bottom 95 or the bottom 90%, we want to feel like that these tax cuts were for us. And it's just you're not really paying attention to what's happening. And in some cases, you're not even counting. If I give you $1 today, but now you have to take that $1 and go pay for $5 worth of stuff that I provided to you free before, are you really getting ahead? And we've seen that when, Bernie Sanders was talking about Medicare for all, we've seen a lot of Americans just can't count. A lot of people out there don't even know how to use a calculator. If I give you something that you used to pay $5 from, but I charge you $2, I've basically saved you $3. But because you don't keep the net, you don't keep the net calculation going, or you don't add and subtract right, you can't see that, like, even though you're paying $2 that you didn't pay before, you're saving $5 that you paid before. So you're net plus 3, right?
Right.
5 minus 2 is 3. But again, you know, we have to go back to school, make sure everybody knows how to count, and not just, you know, right in front of them, you know, have to be able to count from 2 different sources. Like, we need to be able to walk and chew bubble gum. But in many cases, I see that we just can't do that.
I mean,
so we have to make
getting,
sure that
getting the population where they are today was a bipartisan effort of getting a, because we could very easily, being the wealthiest country in the world, have by far one of the top educated societies, or like broadly, you know, like not just the very top institutions of the world, but also broadly as a nation be one of the best educated populations in the world. But we've noticed, we've been talking about for decades, you know, the failings of the American institutions of public schooling, and as far as the widespread education. So getting people the lack of civics understanding and all the things, like, that was a process, and that, like, as we were developing through the technological age, through computers, we could have seen comparable developments in the understanding of civics and the understanding of engagement and democracy and all those things, but we didn't, and that wasn't on accident. We see it also, what comes to my mind, we mentioned earlier about how, with the Obama comparison to Trump, I think of how New York was used as an example and a justification for a lot of the voting laws that are being passed in the South and decried by Democrats. In democratic New York was the inspiration or the justification that a lot of those southern states used to pass those laws. So if we don't understand how the context of these things, that we're easily painted onto one side or taking one side in an argument when really they're both arguing against us and our interests.
That's right. That's right. And I think we've been talking for an hour. This is a long video, guys. We're going to go ahead and close it out here. But I'm going to give you a preview. Next episode, you know, we're going to be talking about Democrats. Democrats have seen some wins. They've seen some victories here. But right out the gates, we're already seeing some problems. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about bipartisanship. And we're going to get to the basics, to the nitty gritty, you know, basically we're going to be talking about Dems, and that's really been my bread and butter. Like, I talk about them all the time and everybody doesn't want to hear it. But until we are able to really get a grapple on what we're up against and drop the delusions, like they're on our side and we have some representation, we're not getting anywhere. So I want to go ahead and close out with that. And remember, folks, pessimists because of intelligence, optimists because of will.